So in the late 1940s and early 1950s, the United States was doing really well in a lot of ways. Its economy was booming. It had a lot of successes in the early Cold War in Europe, and it had successfully established a national defense system. However, because of some setbacks in Asia, most Americans were convinced that the United States was losing the Cold War because of the Soviets getting the bomb, China going red, and the Korean War ending in a stalemate. The majority of the US population thought that the US was losing the Cold War. It was not actually losing, but it was a lot of the politics is more of a feeling than a reality. What could possibly explain this dichotomy? What could explain the US doing so well and most Americans feeling like it was losing? Well, there's only one answer. Obviously, it's got to be spies. The only way that could possibly happen is if there were spies in the United States undermining US efforts in the Cold War. And that is what will lead to the Second Red Scare and McCarthyism. Now, let me say off the bat, there definitely were Soviet spies in the United States. Not nearly as many as the United States had in Soviet Union, and also their influence was significantly less important than most Americans thought it was. But the important thing to understand about the Second Red Scare and McCarthyism is it's not based on rational fears, because there were a lot of rational fears. Nuclear weapons, mutually assured destruction, that should scare everyone. Second Red Scare and McCarthyism is based on irrational fears and irrational behaviors that came from those fears. It is a case study of mass hysteria in the United States. The United States has gone through periods of mass hysteria before. This one will be very big, and it will lead to some very unfortunate outcomes. It will lead to people's lives being destroyed just because on the accusation of being sympathetic to communism. So Americans will voluntarily give up some constitutional rights and freedoms in exchange for trying to alleviate their fears. There's so many examples of irrational, but one example, schools started banning Robinhood because that commie is taking from the rich to give to the poor. That is not a rational fear. That is just one example, and there are tons of them. But this is a period of irrational fear, and that irrational fear will lead to Joe McCarthy taking advantage of the situation. Now, the whole thing started under Truman's administration. Truman was accused of being soft on communism, and so he will launch the very first general loyalty program to check the loyalty of federal employees in U.S. history. The purpose was to root out communism, and under the loyalty check program, more than 3 million federal employees will be screened and have to go through an interview process, and some 300 of them will be fired. Now, 300 may not seem like a lot, but a lot of them will have their entire careers completely destroyed. And you could be considered, you would be put on the check program just for having a relative that had been associated with communism or socialism. The idea of being condemned by the actions of your family should horrify everyone. This will also lead to what's called the Lavender Scare. And that's one thing that is consistent throughout the Red Scare is, Second Red Scare, is the belief that homosexuality and communism are tied together. Like, not just that homosexuals are communists and socialists, but that they are most likely to be blackmailed. But there will be blackmail all over the place during this period. There will be workers that will blackmail other workers, threaten them, and so this terrifies a lot of people. So this is the beginning of it, but the government committee that is most associated with it, and the one that will bring about the most terror, is the House Un-American Activities Committee, HUAC. House Un-American Activities Committee had originally started in the 1930s to try to find fascists. The chairman of the committee was a Texan named Martin Dies, and he really was not concerned with fascism, but he was concerned with communism and socialism. So this committee of 9 men, they will try to find suspected subversion in the U.S. government, and the methods by which they do it are terrifying. They would call people in front of their committee and question them just on the basis of that person being reported by someone else anonymously. So you can go to the House Un-American Activities Committee and say, I know someone I work with who is sympathetic to communism, and here's why I know that. You get called in front of the HUAC, and then they say, you have been accused of being a communist. Prove to us you're not. They don't tell you who said it, and they don't tell you what was said. That is insane. That's why it's mass hysteria, and that's one of the comparisons is the Salem witch trials. Arthur Miller, the author of The Crucible, which was about the Salem witch trials, he wrote that actually about the Red Scare, because the same thing happened during the Salem witch trials. You called in front of the panel of judges and told, prove to us you're not a witch. You've been accused of being a witch. Arthur Miller himself will be called in front of the HUAC for that book. So the HUAC, they will terrify people and call people in front of the committee and make them prove a negative. Prove you are not something that you are not. They go after Hollywood, which we don't have time to talk about, but they will go after a lot of people. And the case that really sets the committee off, the one that makes, most famous one that makes all Americans pay attention, was the case between Whittaker Chambers and Alger Hiss. Now, Alger Hiss was a federal employee, and he had risen up the ranks really high. He worked in the State Department, or for the Secretary of State. He was so high in the State Department, he was with Franklin D. Roosevelt at Yalta. So he was fairly high up in the government. Whittaker Chambers was a born-again capitalist. Now, when I say born-again capitalist, he at one point had been a self-avowed communist, but he found capitalism and he preached about it to everyone who would listen. He would tell everyone who would listen about how he had found his way and about how he'd been a former communist. And so Whittaker Chambers was called before the House Un-American Activities Committee. When he was called before the committee, he started telling them about some of the actions he had taken and about some of the spying he had done, and he named Alger Hiss. When he named Alger Hiss, the case exploded. It was all over the news. Alger Hiss was called in front of the HUAC, and Alger Hiss vehemently denied, just absolutely denied, to have anything to do with being a spy for the doing any spy work for the Soviet Union. This actually started to look really bad for the HUAC because Hiss just adamantly denied it, and it looked like any dummy could accuse anyone else of being a communist, and then that person would have to go and defend themselves, which was what was happening. And so this threatened to make the HUAC look bad, especially because of how high up in the government Hiss was. And he had gone to an Ivy League, and he had some very important, powerful friends. So the whole thing was making the HUAC look bad. And it might have really damaged the HUAC, except for a first-term congressman named Richard Nixon. Nixon adamantly insisted that Hiss was lying, and he knew Hiss was lying. And so Nixon will really push for continuing to put pressure on Alger Hiss and really making example of him. Chambers then will up the ante. Chambers will then say, I actually have proof. I have microfilms that me and Alger Hiss that prove that Alger Hiss and I were communist spies, and I'll show them to you. Obviously, this was huge news. A bunch of reporters came, and in one of the most insane spectacles in U.S. history, Whittaker Chambers took all these journalists, all these members of the HUAC outside the city. So he's in his car, they're following him. They drive about an hour and a half outside the city of DC, and he takes them to a pumpkin patch. And he goes to this pumpkin patch, and he said, this is where we hide our microfilm. And he opened up a pumpkin, a real pumpkin, not like a fake one, and pulled out the files. They're called the pumpkin papers. Now, if you really think about how those got there, it is just an insane idea that, like, the shelf life of pumpkins is not that long. I mean, if they really were hiding it out there, they would have to be going out there like once a month and just switching pumpkins, hollowing out a new one. Like the whole concept of how those got in there is insane, but made for a great spectacle. And according to the HUAC, they proved that Alger Hiss was a spy. Now, it had been 10 years since they had done their spy activity, and so they had already passed what's called a statute of limitations. Depending on the crime, you have a statute of limitations, and after that period, you cannot be found guilty. But what the HUAC could find Hiss guilty of, what a jury could find him guilty of, is perjury or lying. He will be found guilty, and Alger Hiss will be sent to jail. I think he served more than 5 years, maybe 5 years or something. To his dying day, Alger Hiss will insist that he was innocent and that he was never a communist spy. And we do not know for sure still. And the reason we don't know for sure whether it's true or not is because in 1976, the HUAC sealed all of their records for 50 years. So all of the records that will determine definitively whether Hiss was guilty or innocent will be opened in 2026. So pretty soon here. But the important thing to know about this, a couple things. First, this was the springboard for Richard Nixon's career. Nixon will make his career on what's called red baiting. After this, he will run again for Congress, completely unopposed in 1948, and then 2 years later, he will run for the U.S. Senate, and he'll be elected, and then 2 years later, he will be made vice president under Dwight D. Eisenhower in 1952. And he makes his career on attacking other people for being communist. So this case will lead to the rise of Nixon, and he will take that to heart and launch an anti-communist campaign. The other significance is the Hiss case, the entire investigation, the entire case, and the conviction especially, just proved to Americans what they already believed, that there are a lot of spies in the US government, and there's a widespread spy network that is undermining the United States in the Cold War. And that's why the United States is losing. This is especially true because 2 weeks after Hiss was found guilty, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg will be arrested. And these two 100% definitely were spies and worked for the communist government, and they had access to important government information. So Julius and Ethel, coming just 2 weeks after the conviction of Alger Hiss, this just terrified Americans. They will eventually be found guilty, and they are the first American citizens executed for espionage in a time of peace. They were executed in 1953. So these two events just proved to Americans that there was a widespread conspiracy of spies that are undermining U.S. efforts, and important leaders were pushing this. The Attorney General for Harry Truman, as you know, the Attorney General, that's essentially the lawyer for the United States. Communists are everywhere, in factories, offices, butcher shops, on street corners, in private businesses, and each carries in himself the germ of death for society. So everyone's worst fears are being just proven true. And someone was going to take advantage of this. Someone was going to take advantage of the fear that Americans feel, because there's always someone that will take advantage of fear. There's always some politician that will take advantage of fear. And the guy that will do that is Senator Joseph McCarthy. McCarthy was a no-name senator from Wisconsin. He had been in the Senate for a while. He had served in World War II. His nickname was Tailgun Joe, but he got that nickname because people gave it to him to make fun of him, because he didn't fly combat missions, but one time while the plane is on the ground, he was in the back and he just wanted to try the tail gun, and he just like mowed down some palm trees or something. And that was his big military experience. So his military colleagues called him Tailgun Joe to make fun of him, but he will run with that title, and he will grossly exaggerate his military career, including he walked with a limp, and he told everyone it was from serving in the military. It was actually because he stumbled down a flight of stairs when he was drunk. He was a no-name senator, though, and he was coming up for re-election, and it did not look like he was going to be re-elected, so he had to make a name for himself. He actually came up with the idea while he was playing poker with some friends, and someone said, you should get on that anti-communist thing, and he said, that's it, that's what I'm going to do. So he will be asked to speak to a Republican women's club in Wheeling, West Virginia, of all places. It was for a Lincoln Day, so he's giving a speech to a Republican women's club in Wheeling, West Virginia for Lincoln Day. And when he did, he made national headlines by going in front of the crowd, holding a piece of paper and saying, I have here in my hand a list of 205 card-carrying members of the Communist Party that are working in the U.S. government that the government knows about and is letting them work there. And so he'll wave the paper in the air, and there are gasps in the room, but also throughout the nation. Newspapers ran the headlines, and this is what will launch his career. The obvious question is, can we see that list? Can we see those names? And he will not give them up. He changes the number to, no, it's actually 58. He eventually changes it to 80 something. And he never gives up the names of the people on that list. He will target other people, but that list was, he was making it up, to put it bluntly. This is what will launch his career, and he will terrify his colleagues for about 3 years. He was a Republican, and even some of his Republican colleagues didn't like him. But they tolerated him, one, because he especially attacked Democrats, but also because anyone that went against him, he just attacked them. Anyone that said anything against him, attacked him, or he would attack. And so he absolutely terrified people, especially when he became chairman of the Senate Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations. And in this role, he will terrify everyone. And he was able to do it because he did it behind closed doors. He would charge people with being communist, socialists, and then they would have to be aggressively questioned behind closed doors. And he insisted behind closed doors because national security. So the hearings were done privately so no one could see what was happening, and that is a good picture of how a lot of Americans felt. Now, most Americans did not, but that look of just utter defeat, because what are you supposed to do? Anyone that attacked him, anyone that talked against him, he would then attack, and he destroyed people's lives. He destroyed people's careers just by attacking them. And he did it without any evidence, too, quite often. He was able to do this with the help of his two assistants, Roy Cohn and David Schein. That is Schein on the left, and that's Cohn on the right. They will be the ones that will help him, especially Roy Cohn. Roy Cohn will end up being his right-hand man and will be the one that, I think I said those directions wrong. Anyway, Roy Cohn will be the one that will really give McCarthy his firepower. He was a law school graduate from Columbia Law School, and McCarthy will end up really relying on Roy Cohn probably too much. When I say too much, I mean he will rely on him too much because Roy Cohn will help bring about his downfall. Cohn will help McCarthy really tailor his strategy. And his strategy was very simple. Attack, attack, attack. You always attack. If someone attacks you, you attack back, and you attack back harder. And someone sues you, you sue back, you countersue. You never admit wrong, and you never apologize. Also, and this goes all the way back, Hitler said this, if you're going to make a lie, make it simple and say it often. And McCarthy will say over and over again how many communists there are in the government. There are tons of communists in the government. And he just keeps repeating it. And he did it so much, he was really good at saying it. And he would give big speeches at the right time of day that newspapers would run what he said without having time to fact check him. And so that is what he was really good at, is getting himself on the front page of newspapers saying, there are communists here, this person's a communist, this person's a communist. And he would do it, he would make sure to do it at a time when there was not enough time in the evenings, like right when they're about to run stories, that they couldn't fact check. Because then a few days later when they fact check and it turns out he was wrong and they run on the third page, McCarthy was wrong, people don't read the third page. They read the front page. They read the headlines. It was true then, it's true now. And so he would do that, but what he was also really good at was just constantly making new accusations. And so he did it so quickly and so fast that he basically was overwhelming the American public with all these accusations that there wasn't time to fact check all of them. And so all Americans are seeing is front page, Senator McCarthy claims there's communists in Hollywood, there's communists in the State Department, there are communists who just accused them of communism everywhere. And he managed to get on the front page and just kept saying it over and over and over again. What's really interesting is he especially associated homosexuality with communism. And he talked about them like they were the same things. And he would, anyone that was against him that was a communist, he would also, he would sometimes label them as homosexuals. And what's really strange about it is Roy Cohn and David Schein were definitely, almost definitely gay. Roy Cohn 100% was gay. And he eventually will die of AIDS in 1987, I believe. But yeah, there's even speculation that McCarthy was also gay. He was unmarried for a really long time in a bachelor. But Roy Cohn and David Schein, they actually shared an apartment, and their level of closeness, even McCarthy said they were too close to each other. So it's just very weird. McCarthy will just terrify everyone for several years, but his downfall comes because of Roy Cohn. David Schein will be drafted by the U.S. Army. When he's drafted by the U.S. Army, Roy Cohn loses it. It's another reason that they were probably lovers. Cohn just absolutely lost it. And he will demand from the Army that they start Schein off as an officer. He does not have to go to basic training, and he gets extended periods of leave to help do the job of working with McCarthy and weeding out communists in government. Now, obviously, the U.S. military said absolutely not. And at this point, McCarthy will make his fatal error. He attacks the U.S. Army. He attacks the U.S. Army as harboring communists, and this will be his downfall. This occurred in 1953, 1954, when Dwight D. Eisenhower was president. Eisenhower was, and I'm sure I'll get pushback from this, but he was a man of character. He really genuinely tried to live with character, and he recognized people with good character. He hated McCarthy. Dwight D. Eisenhower really despised him. Eisenhower also really disliked Douglas MacArthur. Thought he was too much of a showboat and arrogant. But Eisenhower, as president, saw this as an opportunity. And so he disliked McCarthy so much that Eisenhower will make sure there is a trial between McCarthy and the U.S. Army, and here's the kicker, make sure it's televised. So because of Dwight D. Eisenhower, there will be 36 days of televised hearings between Joseph McCarthy and the lawyers for the U.S. Army. And over the course of these 36 days, a majority of Americans will be watching these. Remember, everyone's watching television during this period. And when they see these, when they watch these, they realize that Joseph McCarthy was just a bully. He makes unfounded accusations based on zero evidence and zero facts, and he was a bully, and he was a vindictive and a thug. And also he was a drunk. He was notoriously drunk. He makes himself look foolish. And he will make himself look so foolish that when the hearings end, it will completely discredit McCarthy. McCarthy will be so discredited, his colleagues in the Senate will vote to condemn his conduct. Say his conduct is unbecoming of a senator, which is one of the harshest, it is the harshest reprimand besides just ousting them from the Senate. Only 9 senators in U.S. history have been condemned for their conduct. So he will be condemned for his conduct, and then he just fades away. When I say fades away, I mean he literally drinks himself to death in 3 years. Over the next few years, he's still in the Senate, but over the next few years, he will just be nonstop drunk, and eventually in 1957, at the age of 48, he dies. They said it was hepatitis that he died from, but it was almost undoubtedly liver failure. Had McCarthy been a true believer, had he really believed in what he was doing, he wouldn't have just faded away. True believers that really believe in the cause they are promoting, it doesn't matter if people don't believe them, they still continue to fight for their cause. But he will just drink himself into oblivion. To this day, there are people that defend McCarthy and say that, well, he only found a few communists in the government, or that there were some papers released in the 1990s, the Verona papers, and they show that there are communist spies in the United States, and that there absolutely were. There's no doubt there were communist spies in the United States government. Joseph McCarthy did not find any of them. So the proof that there are communists in the government, there were communists in the government, does not vindicate Joseph McCarthy. I did this a few times, told students, for every individual that you can find that Joseph McCarthy caught that was a communist spy in the government, I will give you 10 points to your final grade. And I only did this a few times because I don't like wasting people's time, and students go running off, do all this research, and it turns out you cannot find one single name of a communist that Joseph McCarthy found. Again, we know there are communist spies, we know the names of some of them, but McCarthy didn't find them. He just accused absolutely everyone, and he did it for political reasons, to make himself, or to play on Americans' fears, to promote mass hysteria. What's really scary about all this is in 1953, before the Army McCarthy hearings took place, a majority of Americans approved of Joseph McCarthy. And when I say a majority, it was like 52, 53% said that they agreed, or they approved of what he was doing as a senator in weeding out communists. Only about 29% disapproved. After the Army McCarthy hearings, the number of Americans that will approve of what he does is around 34, and the number that will disapprove is 45. Two things about that. One, all it took for Americans to realize that he was a charlatan. He did not know. He was a bully. He did not know about any communists in government, was for them to see. That's all it took. Once they actually saw what he was doing, then they realized, oh, the emperor has no clothes, as they say. So that's all it took. It's just once people witnessed him, they got to realize he was not legitimate. He was not serious. He was just a bully and making false accusations. The other scary thing about that is, to me anyway, 34% of the population afterwards thought he was still doing a good job and approved of what he was doing. So the second Red Scare and McCarthyism is a period of mass hysteria, and it is important to know what mass hysteria looks like, because you will experience periods of mass hysteria, and it is very important to be able to differentiate legitimate fears from hysteria and fears that are unfounded and not grounded on anything. Mass hysteria is something that recurs over and over again. In the 2020s, we have definitely experienced periods of mass hysteria. It is important to remember, though, that calling this period McCarthyism is a little bit of a cop-out. And there is a tendency to do this. Calling this whole period McCarthyism is trying to put the blame on that one person. And there are people that will say McCarthy is responsible for this, and that is not true. He took advantage of this. He took advantage of people's fears. But he did not create this. This was created by the majority of the U.S. population being afraid during the Cold War. And it's kind of like with the Indian Removal Act, Andrew Jackson. People say Andrew Jackson was responsible for the whole Indian Removal Act. He deserves some criticism for that, but with or without Jackson, it was going to happen. And my evidence is what happened with every other Native American tribe all throughout the continental United States that were on land that Americans wanted. So blaming one person, it is a little bit of a cop-out. Make sure you keep your head. Whenever you are witnessing mass hysteria and everyone losing it, it is important to know what it looks like. That's why it's important to study history. And if you are curious and concerned, Roy Cohn was harshly criticized, and he was actually fired from McCarthy's committee, but he will go on to have a very successful career. And if you would like to know how successful, look up Where Is My Roy Cohn? He does very well for himself in the future. Hope everyone's doing well.